Hello. Today, I want to talk about the political industrial complex, or in other words, how it is that our democratic system is working against us and benefiting from us being divided, and the really great ways that we can overcome that. I'm going to start us off with a quote by Thomas Pynchon. He is an American novelist, and I learned he was on a couple episodes of The Simpsons back in the day. He says, if they can get you to ask the wrong questions, then they don't have to worry about the answers. Now, in the last video, I was talking about how we can bring conflict resolution and dialogue tools into our political system. And the value of really good questions is actually very important. And so there's something very significant about a system that's maybe trying to get us to ask the wrong questions. And so I'm just going to quickly recap the last video to give us some context, or the last set of videos to give you some context. And then we can talk about what's going on and why we might be asking the wrong questions, and then got some great ideas on how we can ask much better questions. In the last video, I was introducing the role of interest-based conflict resolution that it can play in our society. Now, interest-based means it's method of resolving conflict that's really based on figuring out like what is actually at the heart of the situation for everyone who's involved. And it's based on making sure that everything's inclusive and the absolute need for us to have as many perspectives as possible in the conversation, because some of the issues we're dealing with are quite complex. Right now, we live in a culture that has a win-lose system, but we really need to use win-win processes. So there are basically kind of three requirements for making quality decisions. We need to be clear about what the content is, we need to have respectful relationships, and we need to have a process that is including all voices and is trying to get win-win outcomes. We need Omni-Win processes. But of course, as you may have noticed, the reality is that we have a lot of disagreement right now about what's important. We have a lot of broken relationships, so there's not a lot of trust, especially across our political differences. And we very much have a win-lose process. That's happening in our voting, where representatives are either winning and losing, but it's also the way that we deal with legislation. Kind of put together a bundle of things, and then we say, do you want it or not? So we have a win-lose process. Now, we have processes that are based on, or interest-based processes, conflict resolution processes, dialogue, ways of transforming the conflict that have the ability to integrate a whole bunch of different perspectives and to get them to come with a mutually agreeable solution. We have ways of creating and building consensus. We have ways about for deliberating across very complex issues, but we're not using. And so that's, I think, one of the ways that we can really lean in to fix our system. But it's also really worth noting that the fact that we're dealing with the wrong content and we don't have good relationships is still also quite important to deal with. Now, it might seem like the problem is why we don't trust each other or can't agree on what's even going on is because of ideological differences. And that, in a certain way, is what's being highlighted. It does seem like it could be the problem, but it's worth noting that, first of all, ideological differences are natural. We all have different lived experiences. We all have different ways of seeing the world. And so this is a natural thing that's happening. But the other thing that's important, and this is kind of wisdom that's coming from the world of conflict transformation, is that we actually benefit from all the diversity of all the ideologies and beliefs. Different people with different ideologies are focusing on different information that they're finding important. They're looking at different problems. They're looking at different solutions, and they're lifting up different values. And we need all of those values, information, and the solutions to the different kinds of problems. None of us can actually take responsibility for all of that. That is why we have a democracy. We benefit from the diversity of perspectives, Even though it's not an easy thing to do, at least it's an important thing to do. Today, I'm going to talk about how the system is actively dividing us. And in that, there's a way that it's creating confusion about what the content is or what's important. What are the facts? What are the goals? What are even the questions that we're trying to answer? And also, it's undermining our relationships. It's no surprise that we are siloing out as a culture and dividing and not even getting opportunities to interact with each other. So, one of the voices that's been really helpful for me in understanding this is the work of Bill Shireman and Trammell Crow and their work in a project that they call In This Together. They wrote this really great book, and really recommend this book actually. It's about how Republicans, Democrats, capitalists, and activists are uniting to tackle climate change and more. And Bill Shireman, who was on my last podcast, has some really great perspectives here. There's an analysis in here that I find to be really fascinating. He's a Republican environmentalist and just really doing a great job of like recognizing the value, bridging all the skill sets that are available. So their analysis of what's going on in our system, I'm calling the political industrial complex. I'm not sure if I got it from them, but that's that's how I think about it. And basically the idea is that the government, businesses, the political parties, the actual political representatives, and then secondarily the media and the lobbyists are all benefiting from keeping us divided. They actually get money and votes by exacerbating the division. If they didn't have us being divided, if we weren't being split down the middle and being pitted one against the other, they wouldn't be able to keep making things go the way they want. They actually can't solve the problems, because if they solve the problems, then we wouldn't vote for them. Both sides are basically saying, look, you give us the money, you give us the votes, in 2 years, we're going to get that permanent victory. We're going to win for all time and fix our political system. And of course, there's always another 2 years, another 2 years. So that that permanent victory that they're promising or pretending to promise to us is actually not a real thing. And on the left, they're promising to fix what's wrong. That language actually comes from Steve McIntosh. But basically, the left is promising to fix what's wrong. They're going to fight oppression and they're going to regulate all the corporations and business and stop all the bad things from happening. And you better give them their money and votes if you want that to stop. Now, the right is going to protect what's right. They will keep on making sure that there's freedom and the traditions of are upheld, and we're going to limit the oppression of the government. And both the business and the politics are like, sure, you know what, give us some money and we'll keep on fighting for that side. But again, there's not a final outcome, and neither of these are really bringing us towards finding a solution. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that they're resistant to actually solving the problems. That's somehow how our system is running right now. It's not a conspiracy. No one's in charge of this idea. It's just where the incentives are going. And those incentives spill out into our media and into the lobbyists, which are kind of the interface between all the special interests and so forth, and the government and the representatives. The media benefits from this because conflict is exciting. People like watching people fight and it gets attention. And so if they can say, look at here, this extreme people over here fighting against these other extreme people over here, that is something that people enjoy watching. They don't necessarily get really excited about watching a long, deliberative, slow conversation where everyone kind of gets along in the end and figures out stuff. So that's kind of the first layer that is happening. And this is leading to the digitalization of our politics. Again, my mentor, Kenneth Cloak, talks about this idea of the digitalization. You can think about when I'm saying digitalization, I'm meaning the ones and zeros. We're getting things into binary code. So is it this or is it that? For here, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite pieces of creative research work that I know of, and it is by Tim Urban. He has a wonderful blog essay world that he calls Wait But Why. He has a wonderful analysis and something that he calls the story of us. And it is a deep dive into understanding basically what's going on with the world and why is society going so crazy and why are we not making good decisions and what's the problem. And so he really analyzes this in a really fascinating way. So I'm going to go ahead and share that with you now, and we can look to see what's going on. So again, the story of us, it's by Tim Urban, and we're going to be looking into chapter 9, which is called Political Disney World. And there's 10 chapters to this. And honestly, I really encourage folks to read this. It's a lot to read, and I think he's coming out with a book soon. So I really recommend people check that out. He is pointing out digitalization, how we've digitalized our politics. So let me explain what that means. So something is digital. The opposite of digital is analog. So the natural world is analog, beautiful, smooth curves, wonderful, and it has all the details. But as we turn things into pixels, we lose detail. And so you can see this example of the star. And then as it gets more pixelated, you can see the little rougher edges. And then we have more pixels, and eventually we've lost all the nuance. It's just a square. So that's kind of what happens when we go along the spectrum from analog to digital. Now, he also has another great example of this. This is his cartoon version of a sound wave. And so you can see the sound wave has its little curves and its nuance. But then when we need to digitalize the sound, we have to break it down into computer units because computers are running in binary code. And so you can see that we lose detail on this red pass, and then we lose even more detail on the blue pass. And this is a little bit what it feels like when we're making our legislation or we're trying to organize our complex political reality into something that's in binary code. And it goes so far as our political reality looks something like this. Now, this is what he calls a Disneyfication of our politics. And basically, things are organized into like perfectly good or perfectly evil. And you can see just there's totally good characters and there's totally bad characters. There's nothing in between. I do want to give Disney a shout out in some of their most recent films, especially Encanto, which I saw recently. Darn, they've done a really good job of getting rid of who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. They've stepped into the nuance. Congratulations, Disney. This is how we're thinking about our politics. And you can imagine this. We're just like, okay, is this one good or is this one bad? And, you know, when you have to vote for this person or that person, we do kind of need to start thinking about things that way. And that gets out of the way of being able to manage the nuance. Now, that leads us to this situation where we have left checklist or the right checklist. And we are organizing ourselves such that if you believe in all of these things, then you have to believe in all the rest of them. Now, this is also just then amplified through our media, through our culture, through our friends checking us and making sure that we're toeing the line and so forth. But there's not actually necessarily any reason why someone couldn't pick and choose from this menu. But instead, we are being organized into a digital world. And I think about this every time I look at the red map, blue map. You know, there's always more detail when we get to more pixels, but this is kind of how we're organizing our politics. And so, you know, the truth is, and we're going to go into some more nuance here, we're actually on a spectrum. And I love this ultra blue and infrared, but, you know, the idea is that there's a whole spectrum of left to right, and there's even more nuance than that. In the story of us, he is unpacking the idea that there's kind of two forces that are in our mind. And that brings us to this two-dimensional version of our political spectrum by adding the political ladder. Now, This psych spectrum, that's what's happening in chapters like 1 through 8, is basically like this self up here is our highest self. This is the part of us that is willing to forego our survival needs and all of our irrational behavior by finding what is the highest good. And down here at the little bottom here, this is our like our primitive self. And this self just cares about survival and getting what I want and whatever's best for me. And it's totally all about us versus them. So in our political version of this, these folks are motivated by confirmation and triumph. These folks want to win and they want to, don't want to be challenged with any different kind of reality. The political motivations up here are, well, let's find out what's actually true and how can we make this whole country be better. And so when we get this political spectrum kind of filled in here, at the very bottom, this is total partisanship. I'm on this side, you're on that side. There's no talking about it, and those other people are awful and evil. And then eventually there's like a probably the other people are stupid and these people are wrong, and we're right, and it's a little less entrenched, but eventually it gets up here like, oh, my political party might not always have the right answer. But the up here at the top is being free of any political party. All we really want is find out the solution that's going to work. It's not really about which side is there. This is beyond the checklist that we were looking at before. When you kind of put all these pieces together, you get something that looks like this. And this is our political spectrum. And then you can see that the 2/3 of our American population consider themselves to be part of a political party, that are connected, and that's where they are. But the other third are up here, and it creates this arc. Up here are the folks that are just trying to figure out how to solve the problems. They might lean left or they might lean right, but they're willing to engage in the conversation. So this level of nuance is something that we'll talk about a little bit more. And we'll talk about why our system wants to keep on keeping this divided like that. I want to recommend an article. And this is by the Consilience Project, which is a project of Daniel Schmachtenberger and some other folks. And they're trying to create like a meta news analysis of our political system right now and the various issues. They are very thoughtful and slow and deliberative in their news sources and how they analyze the news. It's really cool. So I'll make sure there's a link here, but it's the article that I'm going to talk about right now is called Democracy and the Epistemic Commons. And again, by the Consilience Project. Now, epistemic commons, what's that mean? I had to look up epistemology again. I always confuse it with ontology, and I never can really remember which one is which, or even what they mean anyways. So epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes a justified belief from an opinion. So it's kind of like, how do we know what actually is, it's not what is true, but what is backed up by actual real information and has been thoughtfully considered, and it's not just some opinion. Democracy requires a really healthy epistemic public sphere. And so basically we need to be able to collectively make a distinction between what is a justified belief and what is just someone's opinion that's uninformed. We need the capacity to do that because we are trying to live in a self-governing democracy. And we need to be able to have a healthy epistemic commons if we're going to achieve successful outcomes, like address the issues that we have to deal with, to maintain our legitimacy, and to avoid the power getting concentrated in those that are able to trick us or actually able to understand what's going on. This is something really important, and I am glad that Schmachtenberger and the Consilience Project told me about this. But Plato talked about like a governance cycle, and he had this belief that we go from aristocracy to tyranny, and that democracy is a step along the path. So democracy arises out of aristocracy, but then it's going to go towards tyranny. And that happens when the power starts to accumulate. And when the desire to accumulate power and to keep power is more important than doing what's right, and it's more important than anything else, that's when we're on the road to tyranny. And that one really hit home for me. I can really sense the folks that are in power, that are wanting to keep power and wanting to accumulate more power. I'm reminded of the quote by Lord Acton, which is, power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so if we're going to take care of our democracy, we have to make sure that we're continuing to make sure it's democratic, and the people who are in power actually need to be thoughtful. The elites, either power of information or actual power, they need to care to make sure that they don't accumulate all that power. And this is super important because we need to have accurate information in order to make good decisions. And if democracy is basically self-governance at scale, at a large scale, then we need to have epistemic commons at a large scale. But wow, our institutions that help us maintain epistemic commons, help us recognize what is like justified belief and what is opinion, is failing. And the media and the government and our universities and the voting process and our institutions are all dropping the ball right now. Some of this is because of narrative warfare. We're getting much better at spinning things, especially with our digital social media world. And also our institutions are declining. People don't trust the Congress, don't trust the government. And all of this is just eroding the quality of our public sphere, of our ability to discuss and deliberate and think about things. We're at a place where we can't agree on the basic realities of consequential issues. We are starting to distrust our institutions. A lot of attention is getting put on false or malicious arguments. The extremes tend to be taking over more information and getting more attention than the actual thoughtful consideration. That means that we're not even identifying the right issues to deal with. We're kind of focusing on whatever they want us to focus on. And we're having incompetent leaders getting in charge. And we're moving towards this place where we have people in power that are making decisions and acting on our behalf, but they don't have any way of getting input from the actual people. One vote every 4 years or 6 years or 2 years is actually not enough input in our system. And that means that we're doing what Plato was worried about. We're concentrating more power, and then that is leading to more concentration of power. And if we follow this along its path, the government is going to cease to represent the will of the people and will actually just start representing the interests of those who have the power to influence them. And if we keep on going down this path, democracy can cease to function. So I really recommend this article. I find it well written. I'm sure that my summary didn't totally do it justice. So check that article out. And now I'm going to continue talking about what's going on here. So dividing the citizenry, as the folks in this together have named, in a certain way, it's working. And there's some things that really are happening here. And we actually got some really cool data about this. I want to share with you a project by an organization called More in Common. It's about the perception gap, and you can go find out more about it at perceptiongap.us. And what they're calling is the perception gap is Basically, it's a poll, and you can take the quiz if you want. That kind of helps you think about how extreme is the other side. And what they found is that we are thinking that there are extreme voices on the other political side, or extreme opinions, or extreme positions. That's twice as much as is actually true. So if you look at the data, like, we tend to perceive each other as being more extreme and more far out and more evil and corrupt and scary, like the Disney binary, than is actually true. So that's scary that that's happening, but it's also encouraging, because actually that means that we have more in common with each other than we ever would have thought. And they also have some pretty interesting data that they've gathered on it. So when it comes to the perception gap, again, this is from More in Common. The more that we follow the news, the more that people are paying attention to the media, the more distorted their perception is of the other political party. So the more the Republicans watch news, the more distorted their perception is of Democrats, and vice versa. Democrats, as they watch more news, they also have a more distorted perspective of Republicans. People who don't watch the news at all, they have a pretty good reality check on what's going on. And then what's another thing that's interesting is that the folks that have extreme political views, so very progressive activists or super devoted conservatives, they have much more distorted perceptions of the other political party. And people who are politically disengaged or moderate or passive, they have a more realistic understanding of like how people are thinking. Now, this kind of might start seeming a little hopeless, but I want to show you an inverted graph that comes from In This Together, because I think that it's quite useful and interesting. Now, this is not a scientifically validated graph, but it's representative of something that's really important. Their analysis and understanding is that about 70% of the population are in this middle space, and which they call the problem solvers. 70% of the population rather solve a problem than be dedicated to their political side. And the other 30% are divided to this group on the far right and this other group on the far left, 15% each. The folks In This Together call them the warriors. And these folks are going to fight for their side no matter what. They don't really care what happens. So they're going to fight for each other no matter what happens. They're going to fight for the other side. So what's interesting is that it's not that, when we have elections, which is the way we tend to think about things, all you really need is to get 51% of the vote, which means that politicians are constantly playing to those who are on the extremes, because they're getting that kind of locked in, the base, as people might call them. And then they're just trying to get over that line. But that only is true if we're trying to choose something in a digital binary situation. But if we actually are trying to solve a problem, we have a totally different way of approaching this. And if we can get a representative sample of the population, such that let's say there's 10 people, if we have 3 people that are going to fight no matter what to the death, and they're never going to agree or change their mind, they're going to be the warriors. Then we have 7 people that are like, we want to solve a problem. And that 7 is way more than that 10. So the people who want to solve the problems like far outnumber the amount of people who rather fight for their position. But the issue is they're just not being represented by our system. And as we said before, there's a benefit to focusing on the fighting. More votes, more money, and more attention for the media. So if we actually have a representative sample of our population and give them a chance to actually exchange the information and engage in a deliberative, thoughtful process, then it turns out that we can get them to agree on things and real shifts can happen. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about next.